It is Monday, December 18th, 2017. My name is Ashton Ellett. We're here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining us today is Mr. Frank Strickland, partner of the law firm Strickland, Brockington & Lewis here in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you very much, sir, for taking your afternoon to talk to us. Really do appreciate it. I was wondering if we could just begin talking about your childhood, your upbringing, education, and how you got to become involved in politics here in Georgia.
Well, I wasn't born in Georgia. I was born in Washington, D.C., and my parents moved to Georgia when I started in the first grade, and that was in Decatur. I went to the public schools in Decatur, and from there went to Vanderbilt University, well-known school in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Little school.
And had a good experience there, and then the draft was in effect at that time for people of my age, so I debated about going into the Navy or the Coast Guard. I ended up going to the Coast Guard OCS program and serving for a time in the Coast Guard. Then I returned to Atlanta with, I would mention one other childhood memory that was somewhat political. I forgot to say it. This was in 1952 when Dwight Eisenhower was running for president, and they actually had some I Like Ike license tags. I mean a metal license tag, just like the regular tag you would put on your car. And I installed an I Like Ike license tag on the front of our family car. So that was probably my first entry into the Republican political arena. Unknown to me at the time that I would enter it in other ways much later, but that's one minor childhood memory.
So you grew up in a Republican family?
Yes, I think so. I think my father was involved in the Great Depression, and for some reason or other, he was not a Roosevelt fan, and those were the things I heard around the family dinner table. So those concepts stayed with me. So, and I returned to Atlanta and went to work for what was then called the Citizens and Southern National Bank.
Mills Lane.
Correct. Mills Lane was the chief executive officer at the time, and I thought that was pretty dull. So looking around for something different to do, and decided to enroll in the Emory University Law School in their evening program, just like my colleague Oscar Persons.
I was getting ready to say, just like him.
And I completed that degree program, and toward the end of that, one of my law firm classmates, Owen Forrester, later to be a United States District Judge, said he was going to work in the Callaway for Governor campaign. This was 1966. Mm-hmm. And why don't you come over and join me in that effort? I said, well, I've still got a job at the C&S Bank, and Owen was working for the Trust Company of Georgia. I forgot what he did about that, but maybe he quit. But I asked for a leave of absence, and I think I went in and talked to Mills Lane personally about that. And he was a hail fellow, well met. He said, go for it. So the leave of absence was granted, and I went out on the campaign trail, and we had a concept of field representatives, one for each congressional district. So each of our field reps went to a Chevrolet dealer in Columbus and drove away with a new Chevrolet. At least my car was a Chevrolet. And I had that at my disposal for my driving needs during that time, and traveled throughout the 9th District for the duration of the campaign. As you might expect, the campaign slogan was Go Bo.
That's right. So
we distributed Go Bo bumper stickers, buttons, balloons, and so on, and tried to hold off on the baloney. And I had a point person in each of my counties. I forgot how many counties there were in the district at that time. You might remember, but I had different routes that I followed to visit with the point person in each county and other people too. And one route went up the western part of the district through Pickens County, Jasper, Ellett, Blue Ridge, and then across the northern counties, Union and Towns. And our point person would identify other people who would be interested in the Callaway campaign. And then all that led to a bus trip through that area with Bo Callaway aboard the bus and making arrangements for each stop along the way and being ahead of the bus. And you quickly learn that the candidate has a stump speech. He may not give it in the same sequence, but he's going to make 4 points during his campaign stop. And you stop and think about it, that's really the only way it can be done. You can't have, most people could not have 4 different speeches for 4 different stops along the way. So we would witness the candidate interacting with people and making his stump speech. And he was a great campaigner. He was a West Point graduate, and he was the sitting congressman from the 3rd District, which is down around Columbus, LaGrange, where the Callaway family is located. And we thought he's a terrific candidate. And in the end, he didn't get a majority. Well, and one other point. In that era, there was no Republican primary.
No petitions.
There was no statewide Republican primary. In order for Bo Callaway to get on the ballot, we had to obtain a huge number of signatures on petitions. And got that done, so he was a legitimate candidate. And then the result of the election, well, there's a further factor in there. Ellis Arnold was the Democrat
former governor
nominee, and his opponent was Lester Maddox in the Democrat primary, and lo and behold, Lester prevailed. So the Arnold people launched a write-in Arnold effort, and our view was that any write-in vote for Arnold was a vote being taken away from Callaway. And that, in the opinion of most people, kept him from getting a majority in the general election and threw it into the General Assembly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you look at the, I can't remember who did the analysis, where those write-in ballots came from, the precincts they came from, those votes were not going to Lester Maddox. They were most likely, they would have been Bo Callaway, if forced to choose between the two, would have been Cal. What do you think, what would it have meant to the Republican Party as an organization had Bo Callaway gotten 50% plus one in 1966?
Well, I think it would have turned the state around politically many, many years before it actually happened. It would have done it in 1966. And the chances are that I might have gone into some position in that administration and taken a completely different route. Mm-hmm. And the same for others with whom I worked during that campaign. But instead of a Callaway administration, there was a Maddox administration, which I thought was a setback for the state. It was on the edge of changing politically, and instead it was more of the same, mm-hmm. just a different version. I really thought it was a distinct step backwards. I didn't think Lester Maddox was particularly well qualified to be the governor. He did a good job of running a restaurant, but I'd say he sort of stumbled through his term, and people who were interested in the Republican cause went off in different directions, but maintained their involvement with the state party and Fulton County Party and other such activities during that era.
So that was your entree into Republican politics and party politics. What did you do between '66 and were you involved in the 1970 campaign or with Hal Suit and Jimmy Bentley and?
To a limited extent.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way...
or I suppose Richard Nixon in '68.
Yeah. I actually was involved in the Nixon campaign in 1968. And sort of as a liaison person, a volunteer.
Okay.
Non-paid volunteer. Unpaid volunteer.
That's the worst kind of volunteer.
Yeah. But a friend of ours, Matt Patton, was the Nixon chairman during that era, and I worked with Matt on various things. And I remember going to a Nixon speech that he made locally, and he stood out in the middle of the room without any notes whatsoever and delivered a stem-winding speech, and was well received here in Georgia.
He had the support of Bo Calloway, which meant a lot in Georgia, especially.
That's right.
So, Mr. Person said I need to talk to you about the Republicans actually getting their own ballot and getting the blue ballot and access.
You mean the first statewide Republican primary?
Yes. Yep.
Well, several of us, after this business of having Bo Calloway on the ballot by petition, realized that it would be necessary to organize every county in the state in order to demand a statewide Republican primary. So I began traveling in the 9th District area where I knew some people. And the idea was to find a person who would say, I will be the Republican chairman in Union County, for example, or Banks County. And then we would have someone, a party officer would come there and administer the oath of office to that person. For some reason, we thought that formality was necessary because I don't remember the nature of the paperwork. We had to demonstrate that we had a person on the ground who was the county chairman. And the paperwork probably included the fact that the person had been duly sworn in as chairman. So I usually called on a vice chairman of the 9th District Republican Party who was William C. O'Kelly, later to be a federal judge. And Bill and I would go up into those counties and have a meeting with a small group of people and swear in one of them as the county chairman. So that effort was going on around the state. Former State Representative Joe Wilkinson, who also worked in the Callaway campaign, was involved in that effort, and we were successful so that the first statewide Republican primary was conducted in 1970. So that the Republican candidates could get on the ballot by qualifying, just like it had been the case in the Democratic Party as long as anybody could remember. So, and that's been the situation ever since.
You got involved with then State Senator Paul Coverdell.
Yes.
Some of his not earliest campaigns, but maybe it was his earliest campaign.
Probably not his first campaign, but soon after that, I got acquainted with Paul Coverdell, and I became a very close personal friend, and we ended up, we were probably both living in apartments at that time, but in the in 1973 or 74, I bought a house in a neighborhood that includes what's known in Atlanta as the Duck Pond Park. And Paul and Nancy bought a house in the same neighborhood. So we became neighbors and good friends. And I became involved in all of Paul's campaigns. He was in the state Senate. Mm-hmm. And those are what you call yard sign and bumper sticker campaigns. And we would assemble a group of volunteers on each weekend during the election season and move around to different shopping centers, sometimes on one of these motorhome type vehicles, mm-hmm. so you could move a bunch of volunteers around. But a good part of that kind of campaigning involved putting up yard signs, and they were not these kind that you have today with the wire where you can stick it down in the ground pretty easily. We're using wooden stakes and signs that would be stapled to the wooden stake. So there was a particular process that you followed. We already had the signs stapled together, mm-hmm. so you could fit it over the stake and then bang, bang with a couple of staples on each side and you were on your way. But now Paul put up a lot of signs on his own. He and I frequently went out in the same car. You need somebody to drive around so you could keep moving, bang, bang, put up the signs, as would his wife Nancy. We'd go around putting up yard signs or putting things in mailboxes. The postal inspectors weren't particularly wild about that, but
I was getting ready to say, I was like,
we would get an occasional complaint about that, but we kept on doing it. And
cost-benefit analysis suggested.
Oh yeah, we thought it was well worth it. And we had a lot of volunteers who were interested in Paul and his campaigns. And Paul was a formal individual. He always had on a coat and tie. He would sometimes relax on a Saturday and just have on a short sleeve shirt and a tie. So I recall one Saturday where I'm pretty sure I engineered this. I went and purchased a golf shirt. So Paul arrived at the campaign headquarters, and there was a pile of yard signs and stakes and a whole group of volunteers in their golf shirt. And I said, Paul, you see those yard signs? You see those wooden stakes and those volunteers? There's a golf shirt over there. And if you want those yard signs put up today, you're going to have to put on that golf shirt. And he did it. So we got all the signs put up on that particular day, but that was a little bit of a jab at Paul for his formality.
Well, what role did Senator Coverdell have in sort of, a word I like to use, modernizing the Republican Party of Georgia? What was his outlook on the role of the party and how the party could work to benefit candidates?
Well, I think he believed in the notion of having a party structure that had some meaning and sort of a place for people, a place in an organization that people could become a part of, and that could provide a skeleton for a statewide organization, a group of people that you could call on to do things fairly quickly. He definitely believed in that. And he found himself, when he got in the state Senate, I think he was in a minority of 4 in the Senate, 4 out of 56, a small minority. And pretty early on, he was elected the minority leader of the Senate. And of course, they were camped out in the lowest level of the Capitol in a bullpen, desks out in the middle of the room and one off in the corner, maybe behind a little screen for the minority leader. That's how the Republican minority was treated by the Democrats at the Capitol in those days. But I think just based on sheer will, he was able to make his presence known and gained a lot of respect, and just asserted himself legislatively, even from a position of perceived weakness. He began to be a factor within the Senate. And also within the party. He was, at that point, was not trying to be the state party chairman, but he was trying to be certain that the person we had as chairman would be a good person and a strong leader for the party, and somebody that others around the state would like and respect.
And he was instrumental, in helping elect Mac Mattingly as state party chairman in 75.
Correct. Mac was elected in 1980, and many would view it as a surprise victory.
Sure.
I can remember being at the Mattingly victory function that night, and the crowd suddenly got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was clear that people were hearing and thinking, okay, this is where the winner is. Mm-hmm. So the crowd got pretty large, and prior to that, that's when he got elected to the Senate. I got ahead of myself. You're right, Paul was instrumental in convincing Mac to run to be the state chairman, which he did. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to remember the sequence of events, because that led to the election of Fred Cooper.
In 81.
In 81.
Yeah. The Cobb County convention. I believe it was in Cobb County. It may have been Savannah. Location doesn't matter.
One or the other. And our good friend Matt Patton was then the state chairman.
Yeah.
And he wanted to seek another term. And he was reminded of the fact that the lay of the land had changed, in the sense that we now had a sitting United States senator. And he was our senior Republican official. And he was interested in having Fred Cooper become the chairman. And that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Because, if I'm remembering this correctly, there were the Reagan folks who were Reagan folks before 1980. Obviously, Matt Patton was Gerald Ford's campaign chairman in 76, but sort of came around to Reagan. I don't believe Paul Coverdell was a Bush supporter, H.W. Bush supporter.
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah.
In 1977, a man came to Atlanta to make a speech, probably to the Rotary Club. And he wanted to meet with some people who were active in the state GOP. So we assembled a group that included Paul, Richard Bell, Paul Womack. I don't know whether or not Oscar was at that meeting, but it was just a very small group of people. And he said, I'm thinking about running for president. And he was traveling by himself. No entourage at all. I haven't identified him yet.
No?
But he said, I'm thinking about running for president in 1980. What do you guys think about it? And we were talking to George H.W. Bush. And I do want to emphasize that when he came to Atlanta, he was traveling by himself. And he came to this meeting solo, no aide or entourage or anything like that. And we immediately liked him and identified with him. And Paul decided to get to know him better. And he did. And before too long, he and Nancy were invited to come up to Kennebunkport for a visit. And I can recall in 1981, we meaning Nancy, Coverdell, and Paul, and my wife Ann, and I went to Maine for a visit, just different parts of Maine, but we stayed in Kennebunkport. And Vice President Bush at that time was in Kennebunkport for a few days and invited Paul and Nancy to come over to their home for dinner. That's not the type of thing you were able to say, "Can I bring my friends?" So we delivered them over to the Bush residence and went out to dinner somewhere else. But just a little side story. The next morning, we walked down the street to a small Episcopal church. As we walked in, we noticed that George H.W. Bush was listed as a vestryman at that church. And so after everybody was seated, in walks Vice President Bush in a multicolored Madras blazer. And after the service, he turned around and looked back at our group, and he looked at Paul Coverdell and said, "Well, if there's anybody in here that needs this, it's you, Coverdell." So it was clear they had become good friends, and Paul went on to become a little more about Paul and some of the involvement of Newt Gingrich.
Yeah. Newt
was coming along, and people got interested in his campaign. He ended up running 3 times before he was elected to Congress. But Paul, there were a group of us that, I guess Paul called it his advisory group or whatever.
The kitchen cabinet.
Kitchen cabinet.
That's the one term Joyce Stevens always
yeah.
used.
So there were several of us in that group, and Paul liked to meet and bounce ideas off people and hear what they were thinking and get advice from them as to this direction or that direction on legislation and other matters. It was a regular gathering. I forgot how the frequency, but it was reasonably often.
Was this always over at his insurance agency?
Typically at that location. And he would use a whiteboard or something like that for alternatives. And one that really stands out in my memory was after George H.W. Bush was elected, and Paul had been by then in the Senate for 17 or 18 years. And he said, "I think I'd like to do something in Washington. What should that be?" So he put up some alternatives on the whiteboard: sub-cabinet, something at the assistant secretary level, or something in the White House, or an agency head. And after the discussion, he started eliminating things, and it came down to agency head, and okay, then let's list some agencies. And the Peace Corps was one of the agencies he put on the whiteboard. And he ended up being appointed director of the Peace Corps, where he served, I guess, about 2.5 years before returning here to run for the Senate, U.S. Senate.
Now, you went from, in '83, you became one of those vice chairmen.
First vice chairman. I've forgotten how I became the nominee. I'd probably been on the state committee for a while.
Right.
And I'm sure out of the Coverdell organization, I evolved as the candidate to be first vice chairman, and I had an opponent from somewhere up in northwest part of the state. Somebody I knew, I can't call his name right now, but I do remember running into my good friend Matt Patton on the floor of the convention, and he said, "Well, I'm not going to vote for you. I know you didn't support me for state chairman, so I'm not going to be able to vote for you for first vice." I said, "Well, I understand that. You got to do what you got to do." But I was elected without too much difficulty.
Well, that was the period where I guess the Coverdell folks, or the Coverdell Cooper crowd, were consolidating power, as opposed to the Carl Gillises, the Ted and Mary Stivers. As you already mentioned, Matt Patton. There was there were still factions going on.
That was definitely a strong faction, and I was a little surprised when Matt decided to, in effect, join up with that group, because that was not a good fit. Here he's a partner in a large Atlanta law firm,
right,
just down the street, and it didn't seem like a natural fit. But we encountered that group. I'm trying to think what the year. You could help me on the years.
Sure.
But this probably was in 1978, where the Pat Robertson group.
88.
88. The Pat Robertson group, which included those people you just mentioned, one-word description was they packed the organizing meetings. The Republican Party organized from the grassroots up, starting with precinct meetings, county conventions, congressional district convention, state convention, in that sequence. So they had loaded up the precinct meetings with their own people, and who then elected themselves as delegates to the county convention, and on and on. And so we found ourselves litigating some things that that group challenged that the state party was doing wrong, and this, that, and the other. And I don't remember, Oscar and I defended about, I'd say about 5 of those cases got filed in a week.
Oh, yeah.
So that we couldn't be everywhere at the same time, so we defended some of them over the phone. And we went down to Dublin. That seemed to be the main case, and a lawyer in Dublin had been retained to represent some dissident people against the state party. And we got what is known in the legal profession as home cooking, meaning the local judge sided with the plaintiffs and entered an order against the party in some form. I've forgotten exactly the form of the order, but we filed an emergency appeal in the appellate courts and got a very prompt hearing because there was an election coming up. So whatever was being complained about had to be dealt with timely, or there wouldn't be a delegation going from Georgia. But as it turned out, at the state convention in Albany in 1988, the party convened the convention, and we had already effected a compromise at each of the congressional district conventions where there are 3 delegates elected to the national convention. And we had, as I remember the numbers, we had the authority to elect 18 at-large delegates from the 1988 convention. So we conducted that election, elected 18 alternates, 18 delegates, and adjourned the convention. Our friend John Stuckey was then the state chairman, and Stuckey adjourned the convention, and the Robertson people went out in the parking lot and held a rump convention and elected their own set of 18 delegates and alternates to the national convention. So the Bush people were furious that we were going to go to New Orleans with a contested delegation. So we got a call, Oscar and I got a call from the lawyers for the national convention and the national committee, asking us to come down here and see if we could settle the contested delegation dispute. And at first we said, well, you guys don't really have any authority over us to direct us to come to New Orleans to do anything, so maybe we just won't show up. But later we decided we'd go down there and try to get it settled, and that didn't work out.
Was this the reluctance of one party or the other to come to a compromise?
This was a contest like that is heard by the Committee on Contests of the Republican National Committee, which is made up of, I don't know how many, but each of those people is a national committee man or committee woman from some state, and they come together as a committee on contests, advised by their own counsel. And we made a presentation that said, okay, we've already compromised with the Robertson people at each district convention. So they got 18% of in the presidential preference primary, Robertson got 18% of the vote. All right, so they're really way ahead if they've got a third of the delegates from each district convention. That's 33%.
Mm-hmm.
And you must take that into consideration in trying to effect a compromise. And so we had a list of 18 delegates and alternates that had been elected. So the Committee on Contest considered all that and asked us to come in for the outcome. And they said, well, here's the list. And they had given 51% of the delegates to Robertson. And we said, this is an outrageous result. But that was it. And one of the outcomes of that was, at the time, the party rules provided that the National Committee man and committee woman were elected by the national delegates.
Right.
So they promptly elected Carl Gillis for another term. And I've forgotten who they elected as the committee woman.
Carolyn Meadows.
Correct. Whereas our candidates for those positions were Joe Rogers and Marguerite Williams. And so I thought that particular decision by the Committee on Contest was wrong on its face. It's not a rational decision and terribly unfair to the voters of Georgia who had only given 18%.
Yeah, I think Robertson finished fourth. I
Way
believe
back.
he finished behind Dole and Jack Kennedy.
That's correct. So the result was illogical and unfair and a real setback for the state party in that you had Carl Gillis, who was at odds with what I call the party regulars, and I would identify myself as a party regular. So we had a dissident as the committee man and arguably a dissident as the committee woman, and it was a mess.
Was that result at the convention, was that the result of the Bush campaign just wanting to wash its hands and move on at the cost
it must have
of
been,
the party?
It must have been because the committee, in order for the Committee on Contest to reach that decision, they had to ignore the evidence, which would likely means what you suggested, that the Bush organization, first place, didn't want the contest because it was drawing attention. And therefore, they might have instructed the Committee on Contest to give the Robertson people what they want. And let's just shut everything down. So that smoothed it out for the convention, but it made a mess within the state GOP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Marguerite Williams made a very public exit from the party.
Never to be heard from again. One of our most loyal supporters.
Became a very strong supporter of Zell Miller, which didn't help in 1990 with the race against Johnny Isaacson. But what do you think the short term obviously created lots of turmoil? What do you think the longer term effects of sort of the, I don't know if inclusion is the right word, but the incorporation of social conservatives, Christian conservatives into the Republican Party? Was it a long-term boon to the party with short-term growing pains?
It was a difficult time. There's no question about that. And we're still dealing with that, even to this day.
That's a fair point.
It's a different group with different issues, but nonetheless, it's a struggle to get what I call a party regular elected as the state chairman. Mm-hmm. I mean, as recently as the 2016 convention, that was a struggle. Mm-hmm. And the same thing about electing delegates to the national convention. That's very difficult to manage.
Do you think it's because of disparity in energy, motivation, or that sort of maybe the activist base has? I don't know what it is. If you go back to 1988, clearly there were more party regulars than there were Robertson folks, but they knew what time those conventions started.
Yeah.
They knew what high school in Cobb County they were supposed to be at. That there was a level of organization that just wasn't there for the Bush folks or the Dole folks or people like that.
They outgunned us that year. There's no doubt about it. And in many respects, never to be heard from again. I mean, a lot of them backed away after that surge, which repeated itself in, I guess, in 2012. I'm not sure about the years, but when the Ron Paul effort came along.
Right.
I forgot whether that was 12 or 16.
I think it was 2012.
Yeah.
2016 there were a whole other about 20 other Republicans running, but not Ron Paul.
Yeah. The Ron Paul group was somewhat similar to the Robertson people. They weren't, in my view, were not quite as successful in packing the conventions, but they did turn out. And I thought they were exceedingly difficult to deal with. A typical Ron, and I had some of these conversations face to face, and typical Ron Paul person wanted to get into the tent, but they cared nothing about anybody who had constructed the tent that they wanted to get in. They just wanted in, and they wanted control immediately. We're here, we want in, and we want to be in a position of authority and influence. Totally unreasonable approach, but they were definitely hard-headed. But many of them were never heard from again. They were totally, in my view, totally aligned with and were supportive of Ron Paul. And as he moved off the stage, they never came back. Not all of them, but most of them.
Well, that's an interesting point because if you think about like the Goldwater insurgency back in the '64, those folks took over and by virtue of running the party became sort of the establishment. Same with the Nixon folks, but the disparity or the discrepancies we're drawing here are these sort of one-offs. The Robertson folks. The Tea Party might fall in a different sort of characterization, although the Georgia State Party wasn't affected quite as much by the Tea Party as, say, Delaware was, or with Mike Castle being beat for the nomination by Christine O'Donnell's, or the Sharon Angles out there in Nevada, excuse me. But going into the 1990s, you were assistant counsel to the party with Oscar Persons, the general counsel. Walk me through the redistricting effort at the state level, because it was very much a coordinated redistricting effort between the RNC, the state parties, but also the Republican Justice Department, which had to execute the Voting Rights Act and the subsequent amendments, which are really what made 91 possible. What can you tell me about that experience?
I think during the 90s, as I recall, we were may have my decades mixed up, but there was one cycle where we were monitoring the process, not a party to the case, not an intervener, but we were following the process closely. And let's just say this was in the 90s cycle when there was a challenge to the way the 12th congressional district had been drawn from Atlanta to Savannah.
The Cynthia McKinney.
Is that the right decade?
That would be that would be 90. The case anyway would be, I think, is a 94, 95 case.
But it's a result of the 91 redistricting.
Yes.
we
the
were
fingers down.
we were monitoring that litigation, and we decided when the case came to what is known as the remedial phase, that is where the court is going to draw a map. This is a court of 3 federal judges, 1 United States Circuit Judge, 2 U.S. District Judges. And the judges on this panel were Circuit Judge Larry Edmondson and District Judges Dudley Bowen and Avant Edenfield. So we decided to file an amicus brief to put before the court during the remedial phase the amicus map.
Mm-hmm.
So we put together a coalition of all of the sitting members of Congress, except Charlie Norwood. They all supported the amicus map. And we styled our brief on behalf of Congressman John Lewis as a senior member of the Democrat delegation, and Newt Gingrich as the senior member of the Republican delegation. And the short version of here's the amicus brief we want the court to consider when drawing a map. And normally, an amicus does not make an appearance before the court. But one day I got a call from Judge Edmondson's office saying that the court would be holding a hearing in Augusta on a certain date, and that I was to be there to defend the amicus map. So I did just that. I went to Augusta and appeared before the court and put the amicus map up on an easel and went over it, the merits of it and so on, and answered questions. And I couldn't say that the court adopted the amicus map in its entirety, but something pretty close to it. And the result was that during that decade, at the beginning of the decade, there was 1 Republican out of 10 or 12, and let's say out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a result, maybe Georgia had gained a couple of seats. So by the middle of the decade, it had gone from 1 out of 10 to 8 out of 12 or something like that. So we thought the amicus map had an impact.
What were the legal merits of the map that you presented? Why was that? Why would the court accept that? What was the legal rationale for that?
Well, we were able to show that you could draw maps that had a more sensible shape.
The compactness.
The compactness of it. And when you did that, and of course you had to be down just to absolute 0 deviation for a congressional map. The goal is 0 deviation between one district and another. So we could draw essentially a 0 deviation map that yielded another Republican district, and we could do that without the retrogression, that is, reducing minority voting strength. And that map looks like this. And it passed the look test, you might say. It didn't have strings going up in all directions to pick up certain groups of voters. So I think it was, you might say it was reasonable on its face. But it was also supported by the statistics, and very low, close to 0 deviation. So it was a credible map.
Right. And the map that, unfortunately we don't have a picture of the old 12th district, but basically starts in DeKalb County and goes down through the old Black Belt or Plantation Belt, the majority minority counties, and then sort of, I think the term was the fingers of the gloves reaching into the African American neighborhoods of Augusta, Savannah.
Yeah. It completely ignored...
A grotesque sort of.
Yeah, it was grotesque, but it completely ignored the concept of communities of interest. There's no way you could say with a straight face that the communities of interest in DeKalb County and Augusta and Savannah were aligned. It was just preposterous on its face. So it was clear that district had to be redrawn and configured into other territory to make a sensible district, districts plural.
How important was this redistricting effort beyond the congressional level, redistricting at the state legislative level? Because we were talking, back when Paul Coverdell was the minority leader with 4, 5, 6 state senators, or with Tom Murphy's, House of Representatives, the Republicans were a forgotten minority.
Yeah.
How important was redistricting to building an actual, honest-to-goodness legislative delegation or a bench of potential candidates?
It was absolutely critical. And as we moved into the, well, as I said, I think the end game from that amicus map greatly enlarged, but you had to have good candidates, but they had to have a sensible district in which to run. Mm-hmm. So we had some good candidates, and they had success, so that by the end of that decade, the number of members of Congress had greatly increased. And I don't recall specifically the makeup of the House, the State House and State Senate during those years, but I'm much more focused on the next round. Where we sued the state.
And this would have been the Roy Barnes.
Yes.
So 2001.
It was the Democrats' sort of last grasp or gasp, you might say, from the 2000 census and the districts that the maps that were drawn in 2001. So my partner Ann Lewis and I are representing the interests of 29 individuals who were in underpopulated and overpopulated districts. We challenged the constitutionality of the way the districts were drawn, essentially on violation of the one person, one vote principle. And that was also assigned to a 3-judge federal district court that included Judge Stanley Marcus from Miami, from the Circuit Court, and Judges Bill O'Kelly and Charles Pannell from Atlanta. A really good panel, and they told us that we could have a week to try the case. So we challenged the constitutionality of the House, Senate, and congressional districts. And we were not successful in the congressional districts, but we were on the House and Senate. So the court entered about a 90-page order and invited, the order was entered during a session of the General Assembly. The court took the view that drawing legislative and congressional redistricting maps is a legislative function, and we invite the General Assembly to draw a new map, and they couldn't do it. So the court then decided they would appoint a special master to draw the map, and they appointed former Judge Joseph Hatchett from the 11th Circuit as a special master, who engaged a law professor to help him draw the map. The court then invited the parties and anybody else who wanted to comment. Back up. The special master was instructed to ignore incumbency in drawing the map. Draw a politically neutral map. And during the course of the trial of this case, which became known as Larios versus Cox, the evidence showed that if you took the lines off the map, that a majority of voters were saying, I want a Republican state House member and a Republican state senator. And the way the Democrats had drawn the map, they were going to get about a third of the districts. All right, so the court declared the map unconstitutional, invited the General Assembly to draw a new map, and then instructed the special master, put the incumbents on the map. So that yielded some open districts and some districts in which current members were paired. So the court asked people to comment on whether or not you could unpair districts. And if so, how far down could you go? And we thought we had credibility with the court having won the case. So our comments were without regard to party. You can unpair down to here. And you go beyond that, the unpairings will unravel the fabric of the map in its entirety. You have to start over. Mm-hmm. So the court pretty well followed our recommendation after hearing from the Democrat caucus, the Black caucus, any individual who wanted to appear and comment. They heard from everybody. All right, so that map was utilized in the fall of 2004. And Republicans picked up 20 seats in the House and took control of the House for the first time since 1870. A dramatic turn of events in the House of Representatives, and it had already taken control of the Senate as a result of the election of Governor Perdue, mm-hmm. who was the first governor since 1870, Republican governor. So some people switched parties, and that changed control of the Senate just ahead of the outcome in this litigation. And that was a major turn of events politically in the state.
How had the Democrats, walk me through the mechanics of how the democratically drawn map, the Barnes map, was able to basically dilute Republican strength down from 50 or so percent down to a third. Was that diluting African American vote, spreading out the African American vote, or packing rural districts or suburban districts?
One of the tactics was in slow growth South Georgia, and I don't say that in a critical way.
The numbers don't lie.
That's right. But in slow growth areas in South Georgia, the districts were deliberately underpopulated.
Okay.
And the thinking at the time was you can do that plus or minus 5%. So we had an exhibit that showed those underpopulated districts, and they were underpopulated 0.499, just one after the other. And by the same token, in heavily populated North Georgia, the districts were deliberately overpopulated, thereby immediately creating a disparity among those districts that made the one person, one vote principle work. And there were some unusually drawn districts that were drawn to protect incumbents and just barely meet the no retrogression issue. But it was if you put some of these oddly drawn districts, you isolate it, put it on a blown up drawing of it, and put it in color. So if you're a federal judge and you look up on the screen and you see this inordinately, unusually drawn map, and it's in color, it makes a vivid impression. So we had a number of exhibits that made those points.
Yeah, I think, and obviously this has been a subsequent, I think this is a post-2010 redistricting, but you mentioned putting things in color. I think there are some really colorful terms for some of the districts. Back in my home state, the Hispanic earmuffs up around Chicago. There's one, I think, in Pennsylvania or Maryland where it's called Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. But
we had one called the Dead Cat District.
That's right.
Which was the 13th Congressional District that looked like the head of the cat was over in Douglas County.
David Scott's.
And the body of the cat came down through South Fulton, Henry, and so on down, and the tail ended up in Gwinnett County. A horribly drawn district, and it was. We came close on being successful on the congressional map, but not close enough.
What's the practical effect of the Shelby County case, the 2013 case, where the Supreme Court, I believe it was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that was nullified by the court? What has been the practical effect of that case on redistricting and redistricting legislative?
The popular conversation is that Section 5 was declared unconstitutional, when in fact, Section 5 still exists. It was the coverage formula that was declared unconstitutional because it was based on very old data, 1965 or 68 and 72 voting data. And when the Voting Rights Act was renewed in I guess it was 1996, Congress refused to update that information and just adopted the same old formula, and that was a problem. In fact, I was an invited witness to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the subject of the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, and I think part of my testimony was, if you're going to renew the act, you got to change the coverage formula. But they didn't do it. So that got struck down. And what that means is that the 16 jurisdictions, including the southern states, some or all of the southern states, under the preclearance regimen, if you wanted to move a polling place from a public building A to public building B within a voting precinct, you had to get approval of the Department of Justice to do that. And it way down in the weeds. And similarly, if you wanted to draw a new House district plan or Senate district plan or congressional map, you had to get that, quote, pre-cleared before you could implement it. So it became, well, one more point on that. After the 2000, there seems to be an old tradition that if you sue the state and you prevail in a substantial way, as in the Larios case, the state wants to move you to the other side of the V, the small V, as in Jones versus Smith. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Larios versus Cox, they want to move you to the Cox side of the equation, the state side of the equation of the V. So in the most recent round of redistricting, my partner Ann Lewis and one of our other lawyers at the time, Brian Tyson, our firm was engaged to represent the majority caucus in the redistricting process. And we began by meeting with the House reapportionment chairman, the Senate reapportionment chairman, and we essentially said, here's how to do it correctly. Do these things, don't do these things. So this is still, I'm sorry, this is prior to the Shelby versus Holder. But
Right, 2011.
So the maps that were produced were pretty good on the face of them. So they were submitted for preclearance. There are two ways to get preclearance. One is you submit the maps administratively to the Department of Justice. The other is you can file a declaratory judgment action in the U.S. District Court in the District of Columbia. So we did both. We had those running on a parallel track. And on the last day, before they had to file an answer in the district court case, Ann Lewis got a call saying all three plans are being pre-cleared. And the significance of that was that it was the first time in the history of the state that its plans were approved without objection, starting from 1965 forward. And so that means the state did it right and is capable of doing it right. So it seems in my mind to follow that if the state of Georgia can do redistricting right under the preclearance routine, that it can also do it right at any time. So I thought the Shelby versus Holder decision was correct. And many people have been critical of that decision. I don't share that criticism, and I think, on the other hand, legislatures have to be sensible in the way they do redistricting plans without preclearance staring them in the face. And it's a great temptation, and unfortunately, in my view, the General Assembly has yielded to that temptation with what is known as mid-decade redistricting. In other words, the term seems to be tweak. We need to tweak this district just a little bit to improve the Republican voting performance within that district, and why don't you and I swap a couple of precincts to get that done? It's a great temptation, and in my view, a bad idea.
Because it invites legal challenge.
It invites legal challenges.
Or I guess public scrutiny even.
Yeah. It's you might say to the short version of this is don't be greedy.
Which I think brings to my next question, the Gill versus Whitford case, which is out of Wisconsin, which the particulars of the case aren't necessarily important, but it's an effort, I think, but from the appellate side or the petitioner side is saying that the courts can have a role in determining what the partisan spread of a district. That I think there's some 99 seats in the Wisconsin legislature, and the Republicans control 61 or 62 after only winning 47% of the vote. That seems, to put it in the Frank Strickland smell test of greedy, or has gone too far in terms of redistricting. Where do you think, as somebody who has argued cases on redistricting and reapportionment, is there a way to ever remove the politics from redistricting? Is there any sort of standard that I think they're arguing that the Gill case is being argued on First Amendment grounds, not necessarily 14th Amendment. The fact that if you can draw a district in such a way that your candidate will never win, you've been essentially denied your First Amendment rights. What do you think of the legal logic of that? And then whatever the remedy might be.
Well, I hope we don't end up in a situation where you can't do anything without court approval. I think that really turns the three branches of government under which we operate, that concept on its head. Mm-hmm. That the legislative branch can't redistrict except without court approval. I think that's an absolutely horrible result if that comes to pass. On the other hand, it's hard to convince legislators that if you don't behave yourself, you're going to invite court scrutiny, public scrutiny, court scrutiny, and you're not going to like it. So you have, there is a provision under the Voting Rights Act where preclearance can be reimposed on a jurisdiction. I don't know that it could be done on, I think it would be extreme to reimpose that based on one case. But you can think of a hypothetical where if you have 10 cases, all with bad results for the state, that a state could find itself with preclearance being reimposed. And I think that would be a terrible outcome, and people could be said, if that happens, to have outsmarted themselves.
Too clever by half sort of approach.
Or something like that. I hope that is not the outcome of any of these pending cases.
So zooming out a little bit, why do you think it was, I want to get your assessment on why the Democratic Party of Georgia was able to hold on to power at the legislative level, the governor's mansion? Why were they able to hold on so long? It wasn't until 2002 with Sonny Perdue, as you said.
I think it was just a habit, for lack of a better way to put it, that people liked the situation that they had. A person would win the Democrat primary and be congratulated. You've been elected, which was true. The election in the fall was a formality if you won the Democrat primary. So people liked it like that. And they wanted to make it difficult for any opposition to rise up. They liked the power, they wanted to maintain it, and they drew districts that would enable them to do that. I mean, this is back in the era of drawing maps with crayons, before the precision that is available today, the sophisticated software. Maptitude is the one we are most familiar with. So, I don't know, somewhere along the way there was enough dissatisfaction with the status quo so that people offered themselves for public office, and just gradually, bit by bit, as populations changed and you'd have enough contiguous people thinking the same way to elect a Republican from that area. And previously it was a much larger area represented by a Democrat. So the growth of population helped that, and people moving in from other parts of the country helped it. And it all came together with just gradually moving along. But the big bump, in my view, was the Larios case. There'd been a lot of activity before that, but never enough to get over the hump. And of course, Governor Perdue winning the election. Well, interesting, the way that came about, it seems to me, is that was a result of redistricting. Sonny Perdue changed parties, and he'd been the president pro tem of the Senate, and next round of redistricting, they drew his district out of existence. So he runs for governor and wins. Same thing with Saxby Chambliss. He represented the 8th district for 10 years, and they being the Democrat majority in redrawing that map, you might say, messed with his district. So he runs for the Senate against an incumbent and wins.
They paired him up with Jack Kingston. They drew those districts together.
So he said enough, and so that was those two events were significant in the history of the Republican Party in the state. And fortunately, those were two good candidates. My view is, if you're going to win, you have to run good candidates. So the Larios case created a lot of opportunities, but it required good candidates running in those districts in order to win. You couldn't run a bozo in those districts and expect to win. So we were fortunate that good people came forward and were willing to run and serve in those districts.
So good maps, no bozos. That's
a good way to put it.
Well, tell me, we're living in an age where Republicans control the governor's mansion, both houses of the state legislature, every statewide elected constitutional office, majority of the congressional delegation. What would it take to imperil that sort of Republican dominance here in Georgia?
Bad candidates. In other words, running, that's one piece of it, is running, let's say, inferior candidates and having that person win and be perceived as a bad office holder. Mm-hmm. Lazy or whatever, just running bad people in those districts could cause the district to flip, particularly in what you might call a competitive district. That is where the political balance is close enough together so that a good candidate from either party could win that district. A great example of that is Congressman Sanford Bishop in Southwest Georgia, a longtime friend. He's a Democrat. Everybody knows he's a Democrat, but he's a great office holder. He does a good job. He represents his district well. He's highly regarded. He pays attention to his constituents. In short, he does everything a congressman is supposed to do. So if he decided not to run for re-election and the Democrats run a less capable person and Republicans run a very strong person, that district could flip, even though it is, I forgot what the numbers are, but I'm calling it a competitive district. But as long as he keeps doing what he's doing, I think he can retain that office as long as he wants to serve. And I have great respect for Sanford, and he's just a first-class member of Congress. You could find some other circumstances where you have somebody who's perceived as a weak holder of the office that was successful enough to win it, mm-hmm. but not successful enough to hold on to it. And I think you can also have, if the General Assembly starts playing games about redrawing the lines, people can begin to peck away at the margins so that majority shrinks. So I think it's important to be a responsible holder of the office to which you are elected. Do the job well, maintain contact with your constituents, don't become invisible and that kind of stuff. Just do it right. Don't fall back into the same old ways that you didn't like when Democrats were in office. Don't repeat that performance.
What about demographic change? Going back to the 1980s and 1990s, it was really the suburbanization that really fueled the Republican Party here in Georgia. And now it seems with voting trends, especially looking at 2016 and then a series of special elections, the suburbs seem to be fueling, if we can call it at this point, a Democratic resurgence, but there's at least signs of life within the Democratic Party of Georgia, which really hasn't been the case, most of this decade. Do you think demographic trends are going to spell some sort of political change here in Georgia?
I do, and let's use Gwinnett County as an example.
Sure.
Gwinnett has had a tremendous growth spurt. It probably has a population, let's say, of 500,000. In the last census, it's probably going to be 900,000 on this round, this round being the 2020. In addition to that, the population has shifted so that if you combine African American, Latino, and Asians, mm-hmm. that may be now, by the time of the 2020 census, that may be that combination is likely to be a majority in that county. Now, that's not to say that all of those people are going to vote exactly alike. But if you assume, for discussion, that they do, then that could flip the political situation in Gwinnett County pretty quickly. I don't mean they would have 100% of the representation from that county, but the percentages could certainly change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems that the inner suburbs, the older suburbs that we're talking about, Gwinnett, DeKalb County's already, you're from DeKalb County. It used to be the epicenter of Republicanism in Georgia, and now a deep blue Democratic county. Cobb County, also once the bastion of Republicanism, is now 55-45 or so. Henry County, about 50-50. Where demographics are always, when it's discussed, is always discussed in terms of it's going to benefit Democrats. But is there a way that redistricting can control for that? The political consequences or the political fallout of demographic change, or is that where you get into the playing with fire area of redistricting?
You do have to be careful about it. The next round of redistricting will be, for Georgia, the first round that's not directly controlled by the preclearance requirement is out.
Right.
So it'll be the first time the districts are being drawn without that parachute, roof over your head, so to speak. But there's also Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially says if there is a compact, contiguous, cohesive minority district, you need to draw it. So the next next redistricting cycle will have to be sharply focused on that. And in addition to the usual population deviations and with regard to congressional districts, zero deviation if you can achieve it. And I have seen maps. The Maptitude software is so sophisticated that it can draw congressional maps, and you'll look at the lineup here, and then there's a number that says 1. You say, well, what is that? That means one person had to be put in this district or that one. It's that precise.
Wow.
But when you draw it down to that precision, you run into issues about, well, have we divided a street or that stuff that doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. But it is that precise. I've seen a map like that.
So I get, with this software, for example, and there's this new thing where to raise awareness of political districts or gerrymandering, alleged gerrymandering, where you run a 5K or a 10K and you try and follow all the lines. What carries the day, the eye test or the statistics, the demographics?
Well, I'd say it's really a combination of those things. You don't want districts that look nonsensical. A spider, for example. I think the guidelines will still be compactness, contiguity, communities of interest, all the while adhering to the one person, one vote, low deviations, creating minority districts where they are required to be created, and who knows what the end game is on that.
Right.
But it can be a different looking map.
Can we ever get to a point where partisan legislatures are capable of drawing nonpartisan legislative maps?
Probably not. I think that redistricting is likely the most political thing that a legislative body does. And it follows that it's going to look out for its own self-interest in doing so. And people talk about, well, let's have a so-called independent redistricting commission. Well, how are those appointed? Politically. In most of the cases I know about, they're appointed by political actors, let's say. So even if you have a commission, it's likely that some political circumstances are going to be woven into the result that they come up with. And I don't particularly favor redistricting commissions for those reasons. I think it's just sort of a sham. It's in the end, it's a legislative function, and that's where it belongs.
To play devil's advocate, I guess, could you not appoint me, Ashton Ellett, to walk over here and hit the button on the computer and a piece of software with smart algorithms has all the data, and out pops a map that is quote unquote fair?
Well, I guess you could, but you then have, as I was talking about a while ago, when the court gave instructions to draw a politically neutral map, they then considered, I guess the way to describe it is continuity of representation. And under your hypothetical approach, you could punch the button and draw a map that might meet all the other criteria, except that you don't have anybody in the process that knows anything about how the state is run.
I see.
Well, for example, the politically neutral map that the special master drew in the Larios case had a number of open districts, nobody in there. And they had, whoever used to be in that area was paired off with somebody else. So you had not too many, but you had a few around the state were just completely open. So under an extreme example of your push button district,
right,
you push the button and you produce a map that has no incumbents in any of the districts. I think that would be a major problem.
And that could theoretically every 10 years upending.
You start from scratch.
There is no continuity.
Yeah, so I think the court that's why the court looked into unpairing on the theory of continuity of representation. That is one of the things that a totally mechanical map drawing exercise is unable to take that into consideration. Mm-hmm. The continuity of representation. And there are a number of other, for lack of a better term, political considerations in drawing maps. I don't know that a machine can determine communities of interest, for example. Any number of factors that need to be taken into consideration when drawing a map that the software can do as instructed, but I don't think can invent on its own without making a real mess.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, getting down into the weeds, getting up above the clouds in some parts. Mr. Strickland, really do appreciate spending an afternoon taking your time to walk me through a novice on these issues, but I really do appreciate it. And on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you for the opportunity.